All right, guys. So we're getting to the end of the book. That means we're getting to the end of American history. That's right. Very little happens in American history, luckily, after the end of the Civil War. Basically nothing, except many, many wars and stuff. But it's the end of what you got to learn. In any case, here we go. Appomattox. This is where Lee is outmaneuvered by Grant and will ultimately surrender using the most famous Confederate flag, which is a white dish rag that he found and used to surrender with. A white dish rag is the most famous Confederate flag as far as that was actually used. Again, the Confederate flag that people love to wave, as they say, my heritage, is not a flag that was ever really used except out of in the Navy had the most. Where is it? Oh, it's back here somewhere. The Confederate flag. In any case, Grant will ultimately help the Confederate, or help the Union to win. Where was it, man? Yeah, somewhere around here. There you go. Here's an actual Confederate flag. The cost of the war. Now it says the Union spent $3 billion on the war. Confederacy spent about $1 billion. These really don't really talk about. The Confederacy could only spend $1 billion. Their money got so inflated that when we're talking about this, these numbers have been drastically changed based on. So they didn't spend. They weren't even spending the same currency, right? Confederacy was spending Confederate dollars, which massive inflation meant that they actually spent way more. It just didn't matter. It wasn't equivalent to. So they've already put these into equivalencies. The Union also is going to have to foot the bill for Reconstruction, so some of that is that. Also, because the Union actually had to pay its soldiers at the end of the war, that's going to be bigger, versus the Confederates, who didn't have to pay their soldiers at the end of the war because they lost. Which is a huge deal, right? If you've been fighting as a Confederate soldier and you've been doing this for the last year or two, and now suddenly the money you've been paid in is worthless. It's not worth anything. All of the Confederate dollars you have is gone. A lot of people lost a lot of money that way. Okay, way more money than they would if they had just given up their slaves. So, maybe don't try and force people to be your slaves. Morphine really we start our first drug problems, drug epidemics in America. Morphine, which is made from the same, derived from the same drugs as our current OxyContin issues that we're dealing with now. Originally as a pain medication, but eventually you can become too dependent on it. Okay. A lot of consequences that we're still very much feeling today. The financial costs, this $1 billion here doesn't take into account all of the destruction of the economy. Okay. Also, the South is going to really, really struggle. I talked about this before. Because of this war, France and England looked for different places to buy cotton from. And the Egypt especially started mass producing cotton, and thus cotton became really, really cheap because there's so much folks who are trying to grow cotton. So suddenly all these people in the South now, their main livelihood, their main crop, cotton, is not worth as much anymore. Okay, the war, this whole thing of trying to hold on to their slaves, was an extraordinarily bad idea for the South. Landmark amendments and a terrible loss. So, again, most of the Congress at this point, right, is basically just the North. All of the Southern senators, all of them had been recalled. If they're going to claim they're not states anymore, they're not going to send anyone to be part of the Congress. And so the North ran away with it. They had all of their, they were controlled both the Senate and the House. And so they passed some pretty powerful bills, including the 13th Amendment, which straight up prohibits slavery in the United States, okay, as well as the 14th Amendment, making sure that African American men receive voting rights, not women. No white women can vote, no black women can vote, just black men, white men, okay? 15th Amendment, 13th Amendment abolished slavery, equal citizenship is 14, and 15th is voting rights. Sorry. So 13, no more slaves, we're all equal, and black men have voting rights, okay? And it'll take, a few years to get all that figured out, but still pretty big deals. Now they then plan to Reconstruction. The North was like, and in fact, I think the quote from Grant is quite powerful here. The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again. Okay, that quote that he says as they're signing it really shows like now we have to rebuild our own area. Like the South that we destroyed, and Grant is particularly responsible for this because he sent Sherman on his burning march to the sea. Grant is responsible for a lot of that destruction, but now we need to repair it. We need to rebuild it because we don't want part of our country to be stuck in poverty. Now, of course, that happens anyway because we're not really good at ensuring everyone gets a fair shake, but they had the idea of Reconstruction. Try to make sure that everyone got a fair shake. And Lincoln's really worried about this, right? You can't just give all of these, well, he did not think, or some of the folks at least, did not think you could just give these black folks an equal measure or the same measure or even a better measure than the white folks at the time, because he knew that was just going to be a recipe for disaster and inflame the tensions between the whites and the blacks down in the South. Sherman, on the other hand, had already gone ahead, and after he had freed the black slaves the slaves in the South as he was going through, he started just straight up divvying up the land and giving land to the slaves. He was like, hey, listen, he saw the terrible lives that these folks were living in, and it touched him. And so he decided that, well, you've been working this land, you may as well have it. And so Sherman decided to go ahead and give the freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. So he divided up all of the land that the plantations and stuff like that he was taking over, and he was just giving it away to the freed slaves so that they had something to live off of. Unfortunately, this all gets undone by the Congress. They eventually give it back because their whole thing was trying to be amenable and try to smooth over some of the tensions that the white folks had. And so when you took the white folks' land and you gave it to the black folks, that made them quite upset. Now, there's no real winning here. I think personally I would have stuck with Sherman's plan, but I think that who knows exactly how that would have gone. There's already going to be a history of race riots and white folks killing black folks who succeed. So I don't know that if Sherman had succeeded in his plan of giving up the plantations to black slaves, former black slaves, I don't know if that would have actually done all that much, because it's very possible that those race riots would have just happened faster. Anyway, so Reconstruction, trying to rebuild, and then unfortunately, John Wilkes Booth, who's a pretty famous actor actually, this is like if Liam Hemsworth, Chris Hemsworth's brother, because John Wilkes Booth had an even more famous actor brother. So John Wilkes Booth and his brother were both actors. John Wilkes was the less famous of the two. And he just decided that he At first they had a plan before the Civil War ended. They were actually planning on trying to kidnap Lincoln, and they were going to kidnap Lincoln to try to end the war. That, of course, fell through because the Confederacy failed before they could enact their plan. Before they could enact their plan. But then he decided he was just going to assassinate him, and he was able to get in there. I mean, Lincoln did not have as much protection or bodyguards as you would expect this time. Nobody had assassinated or tried to assassinate a president before. And so John Wilkes Booth actually manages to get in and to fatally shoot Lincoln in the head while he was watching a play at the Ford's Theater. It's probably the worst thing for the Confederacy since losing the war. Lincoln was a competent and capable president. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, who is, in my opinion, the straight-up worst president we've had, Andrew Johnson no one wanted him to be president. He was only elected vice president because he was from, I think, Kentucky, and Lincoln wanted to try and show that he was not going to just be for the North. He was going to try, at the end of the war, try to be a president for all people. So again, he's trying to make a coalition of disparate people. So Andrew Johnson did not agree with Lincoln on a lot of things. He was not the same kind of man that Lincoln was. But Lincoln tried to do a peace offering to try and connect, a team of rivals is what Lincoln was a big fan of having your enemies, not your political opponents, having them part of your group. And so he included Andrew Johnson as vice president, but Andrew Johnson was not a good dude. And more than that, he was a drunk. He was straight up plastered when they had him recite the oath of office. Someone had to hold him steady while he was saying the oath of office. He was so drunk. He was not. He was a former slaveholder. He was a Democrat. He had just turned to Republican to join Lincoln here, and he was pretty intense. The radical Republicans, the folks at these are, again, radical Republicans. These are very left-leaning folks. If we were to talk about our political spectrum today, but that's still not really. We would just call them liberal, but don't really think about our political spectrum today versus here. It's so different. When we talk about liberal and conservative, liberal means you want change, you want new change to go in a new direction. Conservative is you want basically things to stay the same, right? So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about liberal and conservative. And in this case, the radical Republicans were very, very liberal, okay? They wanted the former Confederate to be punished. Sometimes they wanted a number of them to be executed for treason, okay, which did not end up happening. They were able to get enough control to not do that, which, I don't know, probably wouldn't have been good, killing a bunch of people. But at the same time, what ends up happening because of Andrew Johnson is he ends up vetoing a few things that the radical Republicans were going to do. And what he ends up doing is that you'll see during the Reconstruction well, I guess that's next. We'll talk about that later, so we'll talk about the Reconstruction when we get there. Anyway, just know that Andrew Johnson is not going to be a competent or capable president, and I think he's going to set us up for many more years of conflict. Rebuilding the nation. I want to look at this here for a bit, okay? So, look at the deaths from disease versus the total deaths, okay? So, the total deaths are very close to each other, okay, of deaths in battle, okay, at least total battle deaths. Deaths from disease, though, you had so many more Northerners heading south and coming across diseases they were not prepared for, that you have a lot more death from that. The other thing to keep in mind here is deaths from disease is almost always how more people die in any war at this time and before this. It's not until World War I where we finally have more people dying in battle than we do dying from disease. Okay, and that's because in World War I is where we start to see mass inoculations and vaccines saving many, many lives. Almost the same amount of people dying in prisons, which is also probably a combination of deaths from disease, really, because in prison you could get sick. So these are not separate numbers. Wounded in battle, a lot of times you're in prison, you're also wounded, so sometimes you'd get diseases from your wounds. So I want to talk also here, 2.6 million people served in the war for the North out of 21.4%. Okay, so that's almost 10% of the population. Okay, somewhere close to there. Over here, though, you have 9 million total population, and you have 0.9% volunteering. That also seems kind of like 10%, except it's not, because 3.5 million of those folks were enslaved. So they were not fighting. They were forced to be there, right? So you have 5.5 million, and out of that you have 0.9 million. So it's much more closer to 20% of people who are serving in the war or volunteering to serve in the war. Okay, so much greater participation of folks who wanted to be in the war. Okay, versus the North. The North just had more people. A few things to know there. Let's see. 0.4 million of enslaved folks on the North, because again, those border states still had slavery until the very end, until the 13th Amendment. Okay. And that is the main thing to talk about. So, yeah, I think those are the main deals to look at. Signed law by President Lincoln, provided states with federal land grants, agriculture and mechanical arts, starting colleges, we were one of the last to finally abolish slavery. Brazil's going to be basically the last. Federal government became more powerful as it's dealing with this war, much like how the federal government became the federal government to begin with after the Revolutionary War. You get more powerful in war as people give the government more power so that it can be more effective. All right, well, I think that's kind of the main thing. So that's what you got to know. Peace.